Welcome to everybody to this 10 for North Carolina forum. We're going to be talking today about elections. I want to welcome you on behalf of Carolina Public Press. I'm Frank Taylor. I'm the managing editor of Carolina Public Press. Carolina Public Press is an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan, investigative, and in-depth news platform. We're based in Asheville, but we are statewide in our coverage. This year, Carolina Public Press is celebrating its 10th anniversary. We're having these 10 for NC conversations. This is the penultimate one. We'll have one more coming up next month. But that's part of our celebration of 10 years having been founded in early 2011. We'd like to ask everybody who's here today to stay muted except for participants. If you'll also turn your video off. And you can feel free to participate though through chat. If you have discussions that you'd like to submit questions, we'll be keeping an eye on those. And we have some staff members who will be forwarding some questions to me. We probably will not get to every question. If we do, it'll be the first time that has worked out that way. But we'll definitely try to get to the two questions that people have as much as we can. And we have some excellent questions that have come up. And usually we have really good questions that emerge from the discussion. Let me introduce our panel today. It includes Karen Brinson-Bell, who's the director of the North Carolina State Board of Elections, Robert Korstad, who is professor emeritus at Duke and co-author of Fragile Democracy, The Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina, Martha Kropf, who is professor at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at UNC Charlotte, Christopher Cooper, who is professor, he's the Madison Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs and the director of the Public Policy Institute at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee, and Jordan Wilkie, who is Carolina Public Press staff reporter. He is a Report for America Corps member. He is our key staff member focusing on elections, and Jordan is based in Durham County. Well, thanks to everybody for being with us today. I want to start out with a question that came in ahead that I think is interesting. We had is one of several similar questions. People were wondering, how can North Carolina elections be kept fair and accessible to all voters? And as we think about this question, I also wonder if some of you would talk about perceptions that are related to this, because I think there's perceptions that vary among different people about ways in which it is or is not fair, ways in which it could be more or less fair. Love to hear from some of the panelists on this question.
You know, that's actually a tough question, and it's pretty complicated because there are so many aspects to what makes a fair election in North Carolina and what makes an accessible election in North Carolina, and certainly some partisan disagreement over what's fair and what's accessible. And I think we also hear a lot of talk about how much integrity is in elections. In fact, we've been talking for at least 2 decades a lot about access versus integrity. But in general, you know, I think we do need to understand that there are some people who have a more difficult time getting to the polls, a more difficult time obtaining what they need to do to be able to vote. I think that we need to understand that drawing congressional districts, drawing any districts within the state house, the state senate, any school boards, city commissions, county commissions, you know, we have to really think about how we're doing that fairly and whether or not North Carolina really has the best system for doing that. And we need to think about whether or not our election boards, our local elections boards are well enough funded, because we're just starting to pay more attention to how much money, how much funding they get for running elections. And it's pretty clear there's some pretty big differences across elections. So I'll pass it on to anyone else who wants to talk.
Any other thoughts on that?
I have a quick pivot there, and Director Brinson-Bell, I see you unmuted, so I'll be quick. on the issue of local election funding, this last cycle in 2020, we had a new phenomenon where we had, or at least new to me, where we had a lot of independent groups providing millions of dollars to county election officials and state election boards to help them run their elections during a pandemic. And there was some significant generated controversy about how those boards were accepting money, how they were appropriated. And I know in a few instances from the Schwarzenegger Institute out in California, that the money was actually returned because county boards of election, county commissioners decided they actually didn't want the money. And so I imagine this is something that's going to actually play out going forward, is how do we adequately provide funding for our county boards of elections, and how do counties and the state legislature respond to independent organizations providing additional funding? Now, Director Brinson-Bell.
Well, you actually segued well for me. Thanks, Jordan, because I was going to touch on what Dr. Kropf said about the funding matter. So as the chief election administrator for our state, and working with all 100 counties and trying to be uniform while recognizing that one size does not fit all. The challenges that Wake County has as our largest county versus Terrell County as our smallest county, are unique, but we want to have as uniform a process as we can. So our objective is to be focused on process and procedure and the logistics that go into that, all the various hats that we wear. And I think that's what's really stretched election funding. As a former county election director, we would go before the commissioners and we would talk about, is this an even year cycle or an odd year cycle? Is it a presidential year or a non-presidential year? And our funding was based upon what type of election. But now, as we have been designated as critical infrastructure, as we wear this public health hat that we were not expecting to have on, as part of our procedures with the pandemic, there is a need for consistent funding that isn't directly tied to how we administer the election itself when voting's taking place. The need to secure our data, to secure our systems, to protect against ransomware and phishing and things of that nature, that's year round. That's every single day that we're working to do that. And so, that's an interesting aspect. But, from my standpoint, we obviously have a clear objective to have free and fair elections and to ensure that for every single voter. And so, I think really it comes down to having opportunity. And that was one of the big decisions we had to make going into the pandemic, was would we follow some of the national trend to be an all mail ballot system? And that didn't work for North Carolina. We still, we see the bulk of our voting during odd, at least even numbered years, is through one-stop early voting. And we saw that pick up even more during the pandemic. So we wanted to make sure that we could deliver that opportunity, whether someone wanted to vote by mail, in person, on election day, or at the one-stop site. And I think what you're seeing with the state board members is their commitment to that, because they certainly are adopting one-stop early voting plans that maximize the number of hours and sites and so forth that are available to the voters. And and then we're trying to increase the tools and availability to have information, be it the increased data that's available on our website so that we can be more transparent, or whether it's having the ballot track system or the online portal for absentee requests. It's just making sure that every North Carolina voter is able to exercise their right to vote as easily as possible, and with any opportunity, so that we can have strong voter participation.
One of the things you mentioned, information there, one of the things that we saw a lot in this last cycle was a lot of misinformation. There may have been some deliberate misinformation from some political organizations. I think there was a lot of misinformation that just spread like rumors always do, by word of mouth, social media accelerating that process these days. And I know Jordan and I tried to work on a little bit of whack-a-mole to deal with that information as we saw it coming up. It's like, oh, we better put an FAQ out on this. But I'm just wondering, do you feel like that's really challenging these days? And do we see that something that maybe was unique to last year? Or do we think it's going to be an issue going forward?
It's still a challenge. We even saw something put out on a municipal election day that was not just to North Carolina. It was the same misinformation that was being spread across the country in other states too. And, so it's still a challenge. And the tough part is that there's things being put out there with no effort to check the fact or to check in with us. And, it's not a fact. It's just straight out misinformation or disinformation that's being spread. We make ourselves accessible. We've tried to populate our website with as much information. I think most of you know, or I hope you do, that in 2019, before we even had the pandemic situation, we launched our voter confidence campaign so that people could understand the risks of cybersecurity and what we were, the efforts we've undertaken to secure our elections from cyber attacks. And we launched the hashtag Your Vote Counts NC, and now we have daily social media posts where we're putting out the facts. Mythbuster Monday, Fact Friday. I can't even name them all. And then we've increased our web pages. We have a misinformation page so that people know what the facts are. And we're working diligently to tell our stories. I mean, it's part of why I was wanted to be a part of this panel today, so that I can continue to try to help inform each and every person possible in North Carolina about what we're doing and how the system really works and all the safeguards that we didn't just put in place. These are safeguards that we've had in place for decades now. And we build upon that to try to ensure the security and safety of our elections.
Let me, if you don't mind, let me
Please.
make a couple of points that are pretty important here. Is that North Carolina's always had a lot of procedures for auditing ballots, for making sure things are done correctly, and they're very transparent. But a problem that North Carolina election officials have had, although, I hear about this in other places a lot more than I heard about it in North Carolina, because Trump won North Carolina, is that a lot of election officials are under threat and are not getting the kind of trust that they deserve. I mean, North Carolina has the whole gamut of political beliefs among people who are running elections, yet they all are working together to run elections. And the level of trust that election officials are getting and the amount of blowback they're getting because of the results of the election are so terrible that the Justice Department put together a task force to investigate threats against local election officials. So I don't know what kind of, if Karen, I hope you have not personally experienced anything, but there have been some frightening stories documented. The California Voter Foundation, for example, has documented some pretty scary stories of how local election officials are being threatened. It's just this lack of trust.
Right. I won't monopolize the conversation, but we have not received actual death threats, but we have situations where we have received hostile or hateful communication that is of a threatening nature. And we have had some situations in a few of our counties where we are working with local law enforcement because of at least some individuals who, if they haven't crossed the line, they certainly have stepped up to the line where we really do have to evaluate. And there are crimes in North Carolina. There are laws on the books that talk about that threats cannot be made towards election officials and the penalties that are there. We are public servants. We want to serve the citizens, but we need to be able to do our job. And as you said, these processes have been in place, and we are public servants who are carrying out the law as it is written, the court orders as they are issued, and the processes and procedures for every voter in North Carolina.
Thank you. We have a question I want to address more broadly, but I want to narrow in on part of it first. The question is about legislation that might be changing processes and related to upcoming elections. But I want to address one aspect that we know has been litigated, and we've seen legislation that has been challenged on it. What do we expect to happen with voter ID? We had the constitutional amendment that was passed. I know there's a legal challenge to that amendment's legality itself right now and the way in which it was put on the ballot. And of course, the legislation that was passed to enforce it has been rejected by the courts. Can somebody address where we are on that, and then how that affects access depending on what happens with that?
I can give a brief overview of that in addition to what you already did. So there is a lawsuit right now that's in front of the North Carolina State Supreme Court, which is saying, you know, the legislature that passed the constitutional amendment and allowed it to be a vote by the North Carolina people was later deemed to be a racially gerrymandered legislature, and so it had to be redrawn. And so the argument in that case is it was not a legitimate legislature and therefore could not have legally changed the state constitution. That's sitting in some other legal debates at the Supreme Court because the parties are asking for a couple of the Supreme Court members to recuse themselves from making this decision.
That's the state Supreme Court.
State Supreme Court, yes.
Yeah.
And so there are a number of legal hurdles to get over that. There's also challenges to the legality of the bill at all. And while these lawsuits, sort of roll around, we have action by the state legislature that affects voter ID. So the latest major thing that happened is in this bill that it looks like Governor Cooper is going to sign this budget. I'm sorry, that looks like Governor Cooper is going to sign is $5 million for a mobile voter ID unit. And the idea there is that people who don't have access to ID, who face historical structural issues on getting access to an ID. Perhaps they're in a rural place, they don't have transport, for example. They're elderly, they're not able to go to a DMV. Then this mobile unit will access them instead and help them access the ID. Of course, that mobile unit has been proposed before and is opposed in litigation around voter ID because there's not a lot of detail about how it'll actually work or who it'll reach, how effective it'll be. So that's sort of the background about the voter ID. So it's many months, if not even over a year at least, before these court cases are sort of decided.
Thank you.
So I am curious about that mobile voter ID unit. Is it just one unit to hit all 100 counties, Jordan, in the legislation?
Director Brinson-Bell, if you have more details on this, please correct me. But the last I heard of this, there is not a lot of detail. The last I checked in on this, there was a legislative hearing on it, and the Democrats were saying, how is this going to work? If we're going to spend $5 million on it, we would like to know about it before we put it in the budget. And there was, I did some follow-up, and there was not much detail about how it's actually going to work. What I do know is that there's going to be $5 million appropriated for this task.
That's right. There really isn't a lot of detail, as Jordan described. So the only thing I think if I recall, it actually expires, the funding expires at the end of June. So it's not a fund through the entire biennium. But don't hold me to that right now. We've seen a lot in those many hundreds of pages in the budget. So, but there really isn't a lot of detail to that particular funding.
Maybe I'll hop in real quick, and I'm really curious
Please.
to hear what Dr. Korstad has to say, because when I think about sort of where we got to in North Carolina with voter ID, I think about the Fragile Democracy book that he co-authored. I think it really lays out beautifully where these types of laws came from, where the impetus from it comes from, and so I think he's in a great position to speak about that. But I'm not going to look in my crystal ball because it broke like November 2016. I've been trying to piece it back together, and the damn thing won't get back together. But so I don't know if I'll get into what I think will happen. But I will say I think this highlights too the first questions, which was about what does it mean to have free and fair elections. And I think Dr. Kropf has done like a lot of the really foundational work on budgeting, but local government election administration budgeting, not just in North Carolina, but across the country. So I was really glad to hear her talk about that. And of course, Director Brinson-Bell is actually the one who's implementing these. But I think when we think about what is a free and fair election and who is responsible, I think we do need to separate the legislative element from the administrative element, right? And so I think they beautifully talked about the administrative side of this and really the election administration. And I think anybody who spends any time researching, studying, even reading about, talking to local election officials should be pretty convinced that they're doing the best they can to guarantee us and deliver us free and fair elections within the laws that we have in the state of North Carolina. Now, of course, that tension that I think Dr. Kropf talked about very well between access and security, sometimes perceived tension, sometimes a real tension, I think gets played out more often in the legislative arena. And I think there's a perfect example of that, right, with voter ID and everything that's happened in North Carolina. So in some ways, I think it's interesting, right? We've had this battle for a long time. And frankly, I think if the initial voter ID law in North Carolina hadn't been so wide ranging, that we probably would have voter ID in the state of North Carolina now. I think there were 22 separate provisions ranging from, limiting time of early voting to early access for people before they are the age of 18. I mean, there's a lot more in that monster bill, hence the name, the monster bill, and voter ID. I think we are seeing something more narrowly tailored now. Whether that actually will eventually make it through the courts, I don't know. But it is a really good illustration of that tension between the legislative side and the administrative side. And with that, I really, very selfishly, am curious to hear what Professor Korstad has to say about that.
Thanks, Chris. So I think one of the most important things here is when we're talking about free and fair elections is to, get some historical sense of what that means and when has that existed in North Carolina. And I would just point to a couple moments. One in the late 19th century, the legislation was passed by the General Assembly in 1896 that really opened up the polls to people, made it very much more accessible for people to vote. You had very high numbers of people. I think the highest percentage of voter participation that we've ever had in North Carolina. And I would also look in the late 1990s, early 2000s with all the legislation, and this was bipartisan. It wasn't a partisan decision to same-day registration, pre-registration for people under 18 years old, early voting, all these different procedures. And again, it resulted in a lot more people having access to the polls and actually participating in the process. And so, I think this, all of these issues that we're talking about, whether it's intimidation, misinformation, I think about misinformation, just looking at a lot of the campaign literature of past elections. Look at the 1950 election with Will Smith and Frank Graham, the Democratic primary for the Senate race. I mean, that was a situation that was full of misinformation and efforts to try to convince voters that that the one person was going to do something that they had never said they were going to do. And I think the same thing is true here when we start talking about the voter ID amendment. I mean, we still don't have any evidence, at least serious evidence. There's a problem with voter fraud that necessitates voter IDs. And I think my colleague Jim Laludis, in testimony that he's prepared for the federal case right now, has done a great job of proving that whatever restrictions the voter ID imposes on voters, it disproportionately affects African American voters, Hispanic voters, low-income voters, rural voters, elderly voters, and that the voter ID in and of itself, given the way it's constructed right now, it's discriminatory. And he and I have both argued, well, maybe there's a way to do voter ID that's not discriminatory. I don't know whether this mobile unit is the answer to that, but maybe there's a way to do it. But right now, that's not what it's intended to do. And I don't think that the law as has been passed is going to make the right to vote more accessible for people. So again, I think these issues that we're talking about here have a long history in North Carolina. I think it's really important for us to dig deep into why these kinds of differences, these different perspectives we have on the right to vote, why they exist.
You know, you mentioned year 1896 as a year when things were going well as far as voter access in North Carolina. I know a little bit about what happened right after that. And we saw Jim Crow coming in a way that had never before, and a real rollback of voter emancipation or voter access in the state. We saw the coup took place in Wilmington, of course, but we saw legislation coming in throughout the South, trying to enact measures to take the vote away from people, and North Carolina was part of that. I guess that raises the specter. Do we have to worry about that? Is that, in fact, some people are saying that's part of what the push for voter ID is today? Is that a real concern that some of these measures that are being promoted as voter security are really designed to undermine voter access?
Well, I'll just be quick on that. I certainly think that. I mean, I think that access, they're aimed at suppressing the vote and targeting a particular part of the population that votes in a particular kind of way. So that'd be my perspective on it.
Yeah.
I'd also like to add another angle on that. So we've seen one response to the specter, the illusion of certain types of voter fraud is to push things like voter ID. As a note, the documented voter fraud from NC9 in 2018, voter ID would have had nothing to do with stopping that fraudulent effort there. And what we're seeing now, a little bit in North Carolina, very significantly around the country, is when we're seeing misinformation drive legislative agendas around the country to say we need increased security. This whole January 6th push came out of misinformation, and it's not necessarily things that will, like voter ID, necessarily limit access to the vote, but sometimes pushes that will sort of fundamentally change our democratic structure as a whole. One example of that is the resurgence of the independent state legislative doctrine, which is coming up. And that was part of the legal effort, the legal theory that backed the states that opposed certification of the presidential election on January 6th. So we're seeing this relationship between misinformation and pushing different kinds of legal and legislative agendas that don't necessarily have a relationship with election administration that is actually improving the administration for people who are just trying to go to the ballot box and cast their votes.
Yeah. We had a question, I think is a good point being raised by somebody in the audience I want to get to quickly. As we talk about voter ID, is there research already in places where voter ID has been enacted showing what its effect is on voter turnout and participation? Or do we actually know predictably, what the effect of it is? Or do we see something that's different in each state?
So there is a lot of research in place, and some of it varies, but I think the weight of the evidence, at least in one study in Georgia, found that overall voter turnout in Georgia declined when they started voter ID, but they didn't find a minority difference. There's another scholar out of San Diego who had found using the Congressional Cooperative Election Survey that voter ID did reduce voter turnout among minorities. And there was actually a great deal of debate back and forth between a couple of scholars about the validity of the data. But I think the weight of that argument and the best evidence were toward that it actually did reduce the probability of voting among minorities. I mean, there has been research going on since soon after a lot of these voter ID laws have been in place. And some of the very first research was finding that it was Latinos, Hispanics that had the lowest probability of voting. And I suppose there were some that would just dismiss that and say, well, maybe that some of those individuals weren't even citizens, which it really was not a good argument against that. But I think the weight of the evidence, and Chris, I'm sure, has read a lot of this as well, can correct me if he's seen some other studies, because there are just a lot of them right now.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said. There's a ton of them, and I think Martha did a great job kind of giving the rundown and the messiness, frankly, of some of the findings. There are some really smart people debating back and forth. So, I mean, my takeaway from the research in general is that it probably has a small but significant decrease in turnout, a little more among some groups than others. But you can find studies that say the opposite. I would sort of add on maybe two things. One, I mean, it's a great question. I'm glad you're asking it. I would also ask, I think we'd all be in better shape maybe if we'd reframe the conversation a little on voter ID, that by framing it as a which party wins frame, and I've certainly been guilty of this myself, we're contributing to polarization on the process of voting and voting access in general. And so I kind of wonder if maybe we should be asking the question in a different way. And just to pivot out a little bit more, I think in general, the notion that turnout is just higher turnout's good for Dems and for bad for Republicans, I think is something we need to fight against, right? So I was pulling it out the other day, right? So the Turnout Myth book that I'm sure Martha knows makes this argument that in general, turnout isn't always a great thing for Democrats and a bad thing for Republicans. Certainly we can look to our neighbors in the North and see what just happened in the state of Virginia. And I think if we as folks, and I know a lot of folks on this call are engaged in this work because you're passionate about it, if we begin to reframe the question as less one about partisan wins and losses and more one about the health of democracy and access, I think we can maybe actually, regardless of where people end up falling on the specifics of voter ID, kind of move the conversation in a more helpful way.
It's a great point, Chris.
And if I could add on that as well, I think part of the issue with, at least as I've seen the discussions around it, and Professors Cooper and Kropf, please correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the issue around studying the consequence of voter ID is that the methodology gets really confused, because when you have a voter ID that's implemented, you also have a lot of money that gets put into get out the vote. And so there's no real clear experiment in how this rolls out, because there are instances in which there was increased turnout after voter ID was implemented, but there was also many millions more spent on get out the vote, voter education campaigns, efforts to get people access to IDs. So the data here is fairly confused. And if we get to Professor Cooper's point, I think part of the question here is, what is the purpose that voter ID is serving? And back to Professor Korstad, there isn't much of a purpose that we've seen. There is an argument that has been going around both in our state legislature and the national legislature saying, is there a value to have a national ID in general? And, that could take a couple decades to implement and roll out and make sure that everyone has a national ID like they do in a number of other states. I live with someone from France, and she thinks it's wild that people have difficulty accessing an ID. And it's just the state of our institutions that, voter ID is an issue access because our institutions aren't strong enough and historically strong enough to guarantee that everyone has access to this kind of ID and therefore access to the vote.
Historically decentralized, right? And our birth certificates decentralized. Getting a driver's license decentralized. And I will say too, I like the way Chris is thinking about it too, because I think one thing that we haven't talked about, and this one of the reasons I've started studying how much money, how much budget locals are getting to run their elections. Holy moly, I mean, trying to implement a voter ID system, I can't imagine anything other than it being fairly expensive and in some ways burdensome. we do a lot of things that are expensive and burdensome if, in fact, we know that the outcome is going to be something that helps. But again, yeah, Professor Korstad, you're absolutely right. Like, it's not entirely clear that we're solving some sort of problem. Again, it's not a super easy. I think we take elections so for granted. We don't realize that some offices have as few as 3 people working in them. And even if the population of that county is small, you know, those 3 people have to work out all of the problems with people who maybe didn't have the right IDs, with provisional votes and all of the attendant things that go with it. So that's going to be one of my areas of study, is how much it costs. We're trying to figure out how to study that, actually. I've been thinking about that a lot.
I think we're schizophrenic in this country too. You know, I mean, the same people who are supporting, or at least some of the same people supporting voter ID, think if they get a vaccine, the federal government is going to put a chip in their shoulder, you know, to be watching over them from now to the end of, you know, for eternity. But so it's like, I mean, you know, I mean, I think that a lot of this election stuff is, yeah, it's kind of, it's why this voter ID and the whole concept of voter fraud is, I mean, I think a lot of it is, again, I mean, I think just in and of itself, it's misinformation. Okay. I mean, I think we need to think of it about that. It's propaganda. It's a way of mobilizing particular voters. And I think Republicans are very, in North Carolina at least, are very clear. I mean, there's a quote in our book from Dallas Woodhouse saying, you know, it doesn't matter whether, you know, there is real voter fraud. It's whether what matters is whether people think there's voter fraud. And if we can, you know, if we can play this up enough and the media plays it up enough so that we can get people to be convinced that there's voter fraud, then they'll support a constitutional amendment to you know, to require voter ID. And so I think it gets back to some of the questions we were talking about earlier about misinformation and just the complicated nature of elections in this country, particularly with the way in which money and advertising is, you know, has become the centerpiece of what democracy seems to be about.
And I have sort of a question about voter ID. I mean, it seems it's not clear to me what the real purpose of implementing voter ID is. And Professor Korstad, you were mentioning about driving voters to the polls. And I see this sort of regularly with these issues around voter ID, around the integrity of the elections. It seems to me like the integrity of the election itself is now a tool being used to drive people to the polls. Am I imagining that, or is that really something that the other folks on this call are seeing as well? Because that feels dangerous to me, because people are, you know, and the threats to election officials, for example, are really seeing election administration as sort of a do or die for our democracy, and it's just really ramped up, you know, the emotions around how election is run, while most people don't actually understand how it's run. So there's that dichotomy feels pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
I think it is dangerous. And I think when, yeah, I mean, one interesting thing right in this last election, and, you know a lot of the names on this call anyway, so you guys are familiar with this, but, you know, vote by mail, for example, was a Republican, I don't want to say tool, because it wasn't a tool of the Republican Party, but it was used more by Republicans than Democrats until it shifted this time. I mean, polarization has come to the way we vote, and I fear that it has come to the act of voting itself. So this is like the least scientific thing in the world, but I got one of those t-shirts that said vote, and I like wore it somewhere, and somebody made it was like, damn liberal. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, right? And so I talked to this conservative media friend of mine, and I said, do you think wearing a t-shirt that says vote is a liberal act? And he said, yeah, absolutely, that's a liberal act. And I think that's really, I don't quite know what to do with that, but I think
Right.
it's really interesting. I've been thinking about, like Martha's been thinking about ways to study sort of this budget piece. I've been trying to figure out how to study this kind of affective polarization on the
Yeah.
act of voting. Like if we say to people, the boards of elections should try to increase voter turnout, is that itself perceived as an inherently partisan act?
Well, right. And so like the kinds of voter education that they put out, or trips to the nursing homes or trips to the schools, is that really partisan, or is that just part of, the educative, I guess is the word, job
Right.
of election administrators? I mean, I'm flabbergasted that someone said that to you. I am flabbergasted. Robert is not surprised.
I'm not
Professor Korstad,
surprised.
not surprised, but I'm flabbergasted.
Mhm. Well, I think, voter turnout is critical in elections in this country, because such a low percentage of, a relatively low percentage, given, most industrialized democracy, a low percentage of people actually vote. So, how you get people to the polls, who goes to the polls and stuff is, is really key in winning elections. And then we have to think about what does it mean to win elections? Why do people want to do that? I mean, these are a lot of the larger issues that are here. I mean, why is this such an important issue for people? And anyway, I saw a couple questions, and I'm not an expert on this, but some of y'all are on. I think it's on people's minds about gerrymandering.
Yeah, I was going to bring that
just
up
saw
next.
some-
I'm glad you mentioned that, and we've spent some good time on voter ID. But I do want to ask about people's perception of gerrymandering and how it's affecting the vote in North Carolina. Is it a real problem? I mean, that's something the courts are trying to decide in part right now, and we've seen past courts force the state to redraw districts. What's our read on what's happening with gerrymandering at the moment, and how it's going to affect things, especially in the coming year?
Well, I think the maps that came out for the state congressional districts, I mean, they're already being challenged, right? And just a quick look and some, look at using Dave's redistricting app and some of the other apps that you can look at, and it shows you what the districts look like, and having some knowledge about various counties in North Carolina and the racial composition. In fact, that's what my seniors are studying right now. We're looking at election processes in counties and, thinking about the county as a whole. I mean, it seems like, I'm certainly not an expert at voting, and I'm sorry, I'm outside on my screened-in porch, and it sounds like everybody and their dog are mowing their lawns right now. But I think it looks like I can certainly see why there would be a Voting Rights Act challenge on those districts.
We saw the grounds on which the court ruled 2 years ago, or I guess it was 2 years ago now, and gave us the districts that we voted on last time as a result of the redrawing. They talked about hyper-partisan gerrymandering, which wasn't an absolute rule against partisan gerrymandering, only hyper-partisan gerrymandering. That similar type of reasoning might prevail looking at the maps we see now.
We've got three as of last night, right? I believe there are 3 active cases taking various strategies. Certainly, it's possible. I mean, and I think the notion of hyper-partisan gerrymandering is sort of key, right? I mean, it is kind of the old Potter Stewart line, right? I know it when I see it to some degree, and I think we've seen the court weigh in on that a little bit more. I also think we're getting a lot better at this, and the one thing I would sort of caution people as you're thinking about these issues is sometimes when I speak to groups about redistricting or gerrymandering, I think that they want to hear, well, there's a sharp line in the sand exactly here. And if you're a 82.2, then it's a gerrymandered. If you're an 82.1, it's not. And I don't think it's going to work quite that way. I think we're getting a lot better, but we need to be comfortable with multiple metrics. And so my sort of bad analogy of this is I was on a mountain bike ride with a friend of mine who's like a botanist. And she said, oh, it's good we've got trails in this particular woods because it's a degradative forest. So like we can do our mountain bike junk and it doesn't bother anybody. I said, why is it a degradative forest? And she says, well, you see all that, those invasive species over there? Yeah. You see this dirt over here that, isn't doing the thing dirt's supposed to be doing here. And she would point out 5 or 6 different things on the trail that told her this is a degradative forest. There's just because she pointed out 5 different examples and didn't give me a sharp metric, didn't make me think she's full of it. It actually made me think, wow, she's thought about this. And no matter the angle, we're getting the same answer. And it's an answer that we can also see with our eye. Like I can be in the woods and say, these are pretty woods. These woods are kind of a mess. And I think the average person is beginning to be able to do that with gerrymandering too. So I think we just need to be comfortable with thinking about it from multiple angles.
Do we think the legislative doctrine is going to play into the courts this time? The idea that's been floated around in several states that, the Constitution says it's up to the legislatures. Should we be allowing state courts to step in? 2 years ago, we saw the federal court saying hands off. Do we think it's going to stay that way?
I mean, in a lot of states, there is a right to vote, a positive right to vote in the Constitution, and it's not necessarily that way across all states. So, I mean, certainly there is probably a good argument for letting the state courts make some decisions, but just leaving the state legislatures and saying, you're not saying it that the courts can't say it's a political matter, we're not going to get into it, but that's where we got into the mess in the 60s. We had these crazy districts. State courts have traditionally sort of gone in lockstep with the federal courts, but in some ways the Constitution does. State constitutions in some ways are a little bit different from the federal Constitution. So, maybe it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, and the federal Constitution can still protect against gerrymandering if it's racial gerrymandering. The decision a couple of years ago said that the federal courts won't rule on political gerrymandering. Right. And that's something that the state court did decide that they will protect against, as you mentioned earlier, Frank, with hyper-partisan maps. And that's the reason why you see an increase in attention in these court cases in North Carolina State Court. Just to, I know the panelists on this call know that, but just to give our listeners a little more context there.
Thanks, Jordan. Well, one thing we were going to hit on a minute ago, we got bogged down on a very important topic with voter ID, but I want to come back to it, is the question of other legislation that we are seeing take place that may be changing some things. What should voters look for as a result of legislation? I know we had a big budget pass this week, and there could be some things that will be coming out of the budget as well. What changes could we expect as we go into this big election year in 2022?
Well, North Carolina actually hasn't had as much legislative change as many other states in the country. Though I can say that while we've been gathered here, there's been a legislative committee hearing 3 different election bills. So since they have not adjourned, election bills can be heard all the way until adjournment. So we are, it's one of those let's wait and see. I think a big thing to consider is there were some things put in place for the pandemic that now are no longer in effect. So where during the pandemic, you could have 1 witness for an absentee ballot, we're now back to 2 witnesses. So that's a change in some ways. But right now we aren't looking at any particular changes. Now the budget bill did change up the authority of the state board members to go into settlement on lawsuits. And the difficulty here is that a decision from a court can come within just a matter of days or potentially even hours of voting. And so it means that we could have to pivot very quickly. But we'll see how that plays out. I think that's probably the biggest legislative change that's coming down, considering that we seem to have consensus on the budget. Jordan, is there anything I overlooked?
No, not at all in the legislative change. I do want to talk about one potential judicial enforced change. If some of these gerrymandering lawsuits are successful in any way, or if an injunction is successful, then our primary elections and our December filing date for politicians may get pushed back, significantly. It's not clear whether or not that'll happen, but it definitely could happen. And in prior cases, the State Board of Election has always filed a brief that says, if these changes happen, this is how it's going to affect the Board of Elections. And I got to say, I'm really looking forward to the State Board filing that document in these lawsuits, because I'm really looking forward to seeing, some dates around it, what the consequences will be for actually running these elections should delays occur.
Yeah, I know, Karen, this happened before your watch the last time that I can recall, but a few years ago, we saw a ruling come down at such a time that the courts ruled after the primaries had already been set. And so people actually ended up re-voting in some of the primaries for Congress. I think that was in might have been 2016 or 18. I can't remember now. It's been a while, but hopefully we won't have to do that.
So I've been in elections since 2006. So I've said that it's not our first rodeo, and we just live in a world of pivoting. So yes, we're ready for filing on December 6th, but we are prepared to pivot if that's what we need to do, because we've done so many times. There's a lot of interesting questions around it, like how do we inform voters of their districts, and how do we do that if it's an evolving or changing aspects. The behind the scenes work is the part that I don't think people realize. We don't adopt maps and they're instantly in our system. We have to have those put in place, and that affects candidate filing and a voter's registration. So there's multiple systems that it applies to. This year, because of the pandemic, the State Board of Elections will likely see about 900 people come in and file. And in the setup of our building, it's not conducive for social distancing or anything. So we are actually relocating to the state fairgrounds. So we'll have to consider if we are moving candidate filing. If the courts decide that, then we move, potentially the location again. And so there's just a lot of logistics that go into even something like candidate filing before we ever even get into the conduct of voting. And then it's complicated even more because we had several municipalities that were impacted by redistricting in the census. And so we've got a municipal schedule that we have to factor in. And the laws around state and municipal absentee deadlines, for example, are different than federal. And so, yes, I anticipate this is the kind of thing we get asked by the courts quite often. We work on a timeline to try to establish, how far out can they move, or how close in can they move, and still be able to adhere to the laws and deliver these elections.
Well, thanks.
No wonder we have.
Go ahead.
It's no wonder we have a lot of confused voters and a lot of people who don't see voting as a meaningful act and something that's going to have much of an impact on their lives. And I think that given the technology we have now, and whether it's about gerrymandering or a lot of other things, we should be able to make the voting process and the whole process of drawing lines of representation and stuff, something that's much more easy to do, and something that's more transparent for people. And I think that the more that we're able to do that, I think the more likely we are to get more people to participate in politics and maybe even run for office. I mean, that's another area where I think all the complicated nature of all this, really limits the kind of candidates who we as voters have access to. And I think that's a big
And
big
actually,
problem.
Professor, I'm going to say that there is empirical evidence that's established that as well. My PhD student, who is now my colleague, Mary Jo McGowan, Mary Jo Shepherd, then wrote a book looking at how complicated the laws are. And then she rewrote that. She looked to see if the states with the most complicated campaign finance laws, if they had fewer people entering and more people withdrawing from elections. And she found that, yes, indeed, that was the case. And she also ran an experiment where she looked at the laws as they're written in North Carolina and then rewrote them in plain language and then compared two groups that were each randomly assigned. And here's a shock, you know, they were more likely to want to run for office in the plain language condition. So just throw that out there. give a little Mary Jo.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I thank everybody who's participated today. I think we could probably go on talking further about elections for another hour if we could, but our time is wrapping up. So I just want to thank the panelists all again. I want to remind everybody who's been here in attendance that we'll be posting a feed of the event on our site coming up. It has been recorded. And just want to remind everybody that we are Carolina Public Press. We're a nonprofit organization. We certainly would welcome people to support our organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We rely heavily on support from people like all of you. You're welcome to make a gift at carolinapublicpress.org. And from now until the end of this year, donations are being matched, and we participate in the News Match initiative allowing that. Incentives to give right now include a digital subscription to the New York Times or Our State Magazine. You can also visit our website to learn more about supporting our work. We'll be closing out the 10 for NC series next month with a wrap up of the year's top news. And we'll look forward to having each of you join us for that. Thanks again for helping us celebrate 10 years of in-depth and investigative journalism in North Carolina. Everybody have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.